the rule that decides what can be saved. When a system begins to fail, not everything can survive. Choices are made, whether anyone admits it or not, and those choices follow a rule. To understand what determines what can be saved, we need to look beyond intention and focus on structure. In moments of stress, systems do not preserve what is most valuable. They preserve what is most connected. Survival is not about importance. It is about position. The location within the network determines fate more powerfully than any measure of intrinsic worth. A component can be essential to the system's purpose yet peripheral to its structure. And in crisis, structure wins. This is not because systems are designed badly or managed poorly. It is because, under constraint, propagation of failure follows pathways of connection, and preventing propagation requires stabilizing nodes where the most pathways intersect. The mathematics of network dynamics dictates outcomes that have nothing to do with the reasons the system was built or the values it was meant to serve. Position in the topology supersedes position in the hierarchy of purpose. This matters because during collapse, effort is often wasted trying to save the wrong things. Resources are poured into visible parts while invisible foundations erode. Attention follows emotion, not leverage. People fight to preserve what they can see, what they understand, what connects to their identity and experience. But these visible elements are often not the structural linchpins. The components that truly hold the system together tend to be infrastructure, middleware, unglamorous connective tissue that no constituency champions. These elements lack advocates precisely because they work invisibly. When they function well, no one notices. Only when they fail does their centrality become apparent. But by then, the resources needed to save them have already been committed elsewhere. The mismatch between what captures attention and what matters structurally ensures that crisis response is systematically misdirected. At first, everything appears salvageable. Interventions are broad. Support is spread evenly. The goal is restoration. But as pressure intensifies, trade-offs become unavoidable. Saving one part drains resources from another. The initial optimism that all valuable components can be preserved gives way to the recognition that choices must be made. This recognition typically arrives later than it should. Organizations spend the early phase of crisis in denial about resource limits, attempting comprehensive salvation that spreads support too thin to be effective anywhere. By the time triage becomes acknowledged as necessary, some components have already failed that might have been saved with earlier concentration of effort. The reluctance to accept limits is psychologically understandable but mathematically expensive. Every moment spent pretending that everything can be saved is a moment when nothing is being saved effectively. Mathematically, this is not moral failure. It is constraint. Limited energy, time, and coordination force prioritization. The system begins shedding parts to stabilize what remains. The rule emerges quietly. Components with many dependencies are protected first, not because they are better, but because losing them would cascade failure. Isolated elements are sacrificed because their loss spreads less damage. Value gives way to connectivity. This prioritization happens whether or not anyone consciously decides to implement it. Even when leaders claim that all parts are being treated equally, the actual flow of resources follows network topology. Support naturally concentrates where the consequences of failure are most widespread. This is not conspiracy or corruption. It is the path of least resistance. Preventing cascading failure requires stabilizing cascade points, and cascade points are by definition the most connected nodes. The rule implements itself through the basic mechanics of how problems spread through networks. This is the uncomfortable truth. In crisis, systems do not save what is loved. They save what holds everything else together. And that decision is already embedded long before collapse begins. As stress deepens, the rule becomes more visible. The system stops trying to preserve balance and starts trying to preserve coherence. Anything that threatens overall function, even if valuable on its own, becomes expendable. This shift is rarely acknowledged openly. Decisions are framed as temporary measures, technical adjustments, or unavoidable necessities. But mathematically, a sorting process is underway. Parts are being ranked by how much failure they would transmit. The ranking is implicit, embedded in resource allocation patterns rather than explicit policy documents. No one writes down that certain components are sacrificial while others are protected. Yet the pattern emerges clearly in where effort flows. Emergency support, backup resources, leadership attention, all concentrate on the same subset of components. These are not necessarily the components anyone would have identified as most important before crisis began. They are the components that network analysis would identify as most central to preventing systemic collapse. Highly connected components receive protection. They are stabilized, subsidized, reinforced, not because they are flawless, but because too many other parts depend on them. Saving them reduces total damage. Less connected elements experience the opposite. Support is withdrawn. Resources are cut. Their failure is allowed, even expected. Because it localizes harm, the system is choosing containment over fairness. This creates visible injustice. Components that may have worked well, contributed significantly, or held promise for future value are abandoned. Meanwhile, components that may be outdated, inefficient, or problematic in various ways receive continued support simply because they occupy critical network positions. The unfairness is real and painful, but it serves a mathematical function. By sacrificing peripheral elements, the system preserves enough connectivity to maintain basic function. The alternative is trying to save everything and losing everything when the attempt fails. What makes this painful is mismatch. What feels essential to people may be structurally peripheral. What feels replaceable may be structurally central. The rule does not align with human values. It aligns with network math. People within the system have their own maps of importance based on purpose, history, quality, and potential. These maps rarely correspond to the structural map of connectivity. A department that produces critical innovations may have few dependencies and therefore be structurally peripheral. A bureaucratic function that seems like pointless overhead may have hundreds of dependencies and therefore be structurally central. When the system prioritizes the latter over the former, the decision appears irrational to everyone except those who understand the underlying network topology. This creates conflict between those making decisions based on structure and necessity and those experiencing those decisions as arbitrary cruelty. As this process continues, the system narrows, diversity shrinks, options disappear. What remains is not the best version of the system, but the most tightly bound one that can still function. The system is not deciding what deserves to survive. It is deciding what it cannot afford to lose. And that decision grows harsher as pressure increases. Each round of triage eliminates more components. Each elimination concentrates remaining dependencies on fewer nodes. The system becomes simultaneously more critical and more fragile. Every remaining component is essential, which means every remaining component is a single point of failure. The narrowing that enables survival in the short term creates extreme vulnerability in the long term. The system has saved itself by becoming a version of itself that cannot tolerate any further loss. This configuration may be stable temporarily, but it is unsustainable. The question is not whether the system will need to expand again, but whether it will retain the capacity to do so when the immediate crisis passes. The conflict peaks when the consequences of this rule become undeniable. What survives is not what people hope to protect. What fails is not what they expected to lose. The system's logic collides with human values. This is an emotional breaking point. Trust erodes. Decisions feel cruel, even when they are mathematically consistent. Those affected see abandonment. Those in control see necessity. Both are reacting to the same constraint. The gap between these perspectives cannot be bridged through better communication, because a disagreement is not about facts. It is about what should matter more, structural necessity or human values. Those focused on survival argue that preserving the system is prerequisite to honoring any values. Those focused on values argue that a system preserved to betrayal of values has lost its reason for existing. Both positions have merit. Neither can fully prevail without catastrophic cost. At this stage, attempts to override the rule often backfire. Saving a peripheral part drains resources from the core. Stabilizing everything spreads support too thin. The system begins failing everywhere instead of in controlled places. Mathematically, this is triage, not a moral judgment, but a structural one when capacity is limited. Saving highly connected components maximizes the chance of overall survival. The rule is indifferent to fairness, history, or intention. This creates a deep tension. The system can survive by violating values, or collapse by trying to honor them fully. There is no option that preserves everything. Loss becomes inevitable. Choice becomes unavoidable. The conflict is not between right and wrong. It is between coherence and compassion. And the system cannot satisfy both without preparation made long before crisis arrives. The resolution begins when a rule is acknowledged instead of denied. Mathematics does not dictate what should be saved. It reveals what will be saved if no preparation is made. That knowledge creates a choice before crisis removes it. When systems are designed with this rule in mind, outcomes change. Connectivity is distributed instead of concentrated. Dependencies are diversified. Critical functions are separated, so that saving one does not require sacrificing many others. This shifts survival from triage to resilience. Fewer brutal choices are needed because failure does not cascade as easily. What can be saved expands because what must be saved is no longer so tightly bound. The architecture of the system is deliberately structured to avoid creating positions of extreme centrality. No component becomes so connected that losing it triggers systemic collapse. No cluster of components become so interdependent that supporting one requires supporting all. The distribution of connectivity becomes as important a design consideration as the efficiency of connections. The deeper lesson is responsibility. The rule does not appear at the moment of collapse. It is written into the system long before, through design, incentives, and neglect. Crisis only reveals it. Every decision about how to organize work, allocate resources, structure dependencies, and build connections contributes to the network topology that will determine what can be saved when crisis arrives. These decisions are typically made without consideration of their implications for structural centrality. Efficiency, convenience, historical accident, and political expediency shape network structure far more than intentional design for resilience. The result is systems where centrality emerges accidentally, creating critical dependencies that no one planned and that may directly contradict the system's stated values. By the time the consequences become visible, the structure is deeply embedded and resistant to change. Nothing decides what can be saved in the moment. That decision is made quietly every day by how connections are built and allowed to concentrate. Understanding this is not pessimism. It is foresight, and foresight is the only way to make survival align with values, instead of choosing between them when it is already too late. Subscribe to join the journey. The rule